Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the REopt web tool. A couple housekeeping notes before we get started. We are recording this and we will be able to share it with you after the webinar. As we're going, please feel free to drop all your questions in the Q&A and we will have time to address them at the end of the webinar. So, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Milana Pakes, who's going to talk a little bit more about the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where I'm from. Sorry, I am in communications at NREL. Forgot to introduce myself.
Thanks so much, Julia. Hi, everyone. My name is Milana Pakes. I work at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory based in Golden, Colorado, but we have campuses also in Boulder, Colorado and Fairbanks, Alaska. And I'm an energy equity intern with the lab, so I work on a variety of energy justice and energy equity projects. And the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is one of 17 national labs across the country, and we focus most of our work on renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies. As the name would suggest, we provide tools, data, technical assistance, platform, and research in the technology of renewable and energy efficiency technologies. And we also research the social science applications of how to adapt those technologies into the real world. And we provide support for jurisdictions and communities in adopting those technologies. And the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is offering technical assistance on communities that are applying for the EECBG block grant funds for helping to develop your EECS strategy document that is required with the application. We offer 20 hours per community to help you create, review, and write the strategy depending on your community's needs. So definitely take advantage of that if you are applying for EECBG funds. Thank you.
Thanks, Milana. All right, and so next I am going to hand it over to Odette from SCEP to talk a little bit about SCEP. And I am also going to throw up our first poll, and that's just going to ask you a couple of questions about yourself.
All right, good morning, everyone. Take a minute to fill out the poll questions, and I will figure out how to share my screen. Okay. All right, so as you're filling out your poll questions, I'll just say good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're delighted to have you with us on this webinar. You are going to learn about an amazing tool called the REopt tool. I'm excited to get a refresher myself, but also for all of you to get access to this fantastic tool. You're going to love it, and it's going to be a really great session. We have a small group with us today, so I encourage you to be super vocal, super active, turn on your cameras, ask your questions, be the squeaky wheel, because you have the NREL experts on right now, and so you might as well take advantage of them in the best way. So before I turn it over to them, I'm going to just give you a couple of reminders in case this is new information for some of you. The application deadline has been extended. So whether you're going to do EECBG grant or EECBG voucher, then there's a new ultimate deadline of April 30th. So wanted to make sure you are familiar with that. Next up, reminder, there's a couple other grants that are due soon if you're interested. Number one is the Energy Futures Grant. We mentioned this a couple times. The due date is November 10th. So if you're interested in participating in that, they're really looking for regional teaming work. So that November 10th deadline there. And the second one is Communities Leap. That's primarily technical assistance for communities that are more low income and energy burden communities. So spread the word. In the right hand side here, you'll see the State and Local Solutions Center. Highly recommend that. They have a great email that goes out every month with all the news And so I really encourage everybody here to sign up for that if you're not on that email list already. And then a quick reminder about the other upcoming Blueprint cohort events. So you all are here with us today at REopt. We have the SAM tool training coming up, and then the Engage modeling tool. We'll have another Blueprint cohort session on the 17th of November. And then the best name ever, the Jedi model tool, will be at the end of November. So making sure you have all of this on your calendar, and we'll get it up on our website soon. And that's all I had. So I hope you have a fantastic training. And thanks again for joining.
Thanks, Odette. All right. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to Kathleen, who is our presenter today. Kathleen is a research engineer at NREL. Her work centers around NREL's REopt tool, a techno-economic optimization tool for distributed energy systems. Kathleen leads techno-economic analysis projects to support domestic and international communities, government agencies, and other public and private sector organizations seeking to cost optimally achieve their energy goals, including decarbonization, resilience, and cost-saving priorities. Thank you so much, Kathleen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and to the EECBG team at NREL for the opportunity to present today and share REopt with you all. I want to make this as useful as possible to you all, so please feel free to ask questions. And yeah, really excited to share REopt. So as Julia mentioned, my name is Kathleen. I'm a research engineer here at NREL, and I lead the REopt team. It's a great group of researchers. I'm hearing a little bit of background. It looks like someone might come off mute. Thanks. Great team of researchers and engineers who develop the REopt model and also use it for analysis and technical assistance across a number of sectors: the federal sector, communities, international work, ports and airports, and the industrial sector, to name a few. Yeah, our goal is to make this tool useful for the public. So excited to share it with you and hope it can be useful for your communities. So REopt is a tool for techno-economic modeling and optimization of distributed energy resources. So these are on-site energy generation and storage technologies, typically either behind the meter or off-grid, as well as some electrification technologies that we've been adding as well. And when a site is considering distributed energy resources, or DERs, there are a lot of factors that come into play. So you're thinking about the local renewable energy resource at your site. You're thinking about technology costs, so capital costs, O&M costs, incentives that might be available, thinking about site and organizational goals and priorities, so cost savings, resilience against grid outages, and clean energy goals related to decarbonization and/or health-related emissions and energy justice. And then also thinking about your baseline utility cost and consumption, how that could compare to costs with on-site DER technologies, and financial parameters. So thinking about not just the upfront costs, but potentially savings throughout that the technology can provide throughout the technology life. So REopt helps co-optimize all of these different factors and help sites identify the cost optimal system sizing of DER assets that could meet their site or organizational goals. This slide has a lot more information on it, but essentially shares the same information presented on the previous slide. So REopt is an optimization engine that's accessible as a web tool as well as open source code. This training will focus on the web tool. That's the most user-friendly, accessible way of accessing REopt's capabilities. But we also have an open source code base that developers and programmers can use for more research and programmatic access to REopt's capabilities. All of the blue on this slide shows inputs into the REopt model, and the green on the right are the outputs. So I'll start at the bottom and kind of share an overview of the different factors that REopt is considering and co-optimizing. So REopt is a time series model. We're looking at hourly or sub-hourly load profiles. So looking at throughout a year, how does a site's energy consumption vary throughout the day, throughout the month, or the week, throughout the year seasonally. So we have a representative load profile for an entire year. And that could use actual site data, or that could be using representative data. And I'll show a little bit more about that during the demo and hands-on exercise. REopt can focus just on electric loads, or can also consider thermal loads, so heating and cooling loads. We're also working on adding process heating loads for industrial applications to REopt right now. And then over on the left, we have the different technology options currently modeled in REopt. So there are a few in dark blue that are currently under development in our tool. But the ones that are currently available include solar PV, wind turbines, conventional supplies, so the electric grid and generators, combined heat and power, energy storage in the form of battery, electrical energy storage, or thermal energy storage, hot water and chilled water. Thermal energy storage, we're working on long duration energy storage modeling right now. We currently have a geothermal heat pump model available and are planning to add air source heat pumps in about a year or so, over the next year or so, I should say. And then we're also working on a hydrogen model. Across the top, we have the different drivers of DER project success and goals and factors that a site or organization would be considering. So as I mentioned, REopt can consider different energy goals. REopt is always seeking the cost optimal technology mix and system sizing. So it's always minimizing the life cycle cost of energy at the site. It can also consider clean energy goals. So if you're just looking to reduce costs, we can just run REopt to reduce costs. If you're looking for the least cost way to achieve some renewable energy target or emissions reduction target, then REopt can do that. And if you're looking to be able to sustain kind of continuity of operations or support a critical load at a site in case of a grid outage, we can also use REopt to identify the least cost technology mix to meet those resilience goals. Other economic drivers I already mentioned in the previous slide: technology costs, incentives, financial parameters like discount rate, inflation, electricity and fuel cost escalation rate projections. We do really detailed utility rate modeling in REopt. So if you look at your electric bill, some utilities, it's fairly simple. You pay per unit of electricity that you purchase, $1 per kilowatt hour. But utility rates are they can be fairly complex with time of use components. So that's where costs vary based on the time of day or day of week or time of year, as well as demand charges, which are applied based on the peak demand, the maximum that you're drawing at any given time throughout a month or in certain time periods within the month or year. And then we also have some market participation modeling that we work on in the, that's not really fully deployed in the web tool, more in the back end. And so REopt takes all of these different inputs and outputs a cost optimal technology mix and system sizing, how those technologies could be dispatched. So when is the battery charging? When is the battery discharging to maximize their value? What project economics look like overall and throughout each year of the analysis period. And then how those DER assets help support site and organizational progress toward energy goals. Oops. I'll probably mention life cycle cost of energy throughout the presentation. So just wanted to kind of share some definitions. So REopt is, as I mentioned, a cost optimization, life cycle cost optimization tool. So we're looking at the present value of all costs of energy at the site throughout an analysis period, typically 25 or so years, depending on what technologies you're focusing on. So when I mention life cycle cost, I'm referring to capital costs of any technologies that the site has deployed on site, any incentives that might have been available to help mitigate those costs, O&M costs throughout the operating period. So that's typically applied annually, any electric grid purchases, and any fuel purchases. And then the net present value of the DER system is the life cycle cost savings, or if it's a negative NPV, then the increase in life cycle costs of the system of energy costs with the DER system relative to the business as usual case. So if the DER system can provide cost savings, it will have a positive net present value. And that's the difference in life cycle costs between the business as usual and optimized scenario. So the higher the NPV, the more kind of net value that the asset is providing. So this slide shows the kind of engine of what REopt is thinking about in this optimization. So here we see a example electric load throughout 1 week. REopt is doing this throughout an entire year, but this kind of zooms in on 1 week. And we see in black the electric load profile. So you can see kind of patterns within the day where electricity consumption is increasing. You can see on the weekends, it's a little bit less. This Friday must have been Friday work from home or something, or maybe a holiday weekend. But we can see the consumption patterns. In the business as usual case, this site is serving all of their electric load from the grid. REopt was used to optimize PV or evaluate PV, cost optimal PV and battery. And it identified opportunities for peak shaving. So this is demand charge reduction, where the utility rate has, if a utility rate, in this case, this example case it did, has a cost per peak kW, that's applied to the peak demand within the month. So if this is occurring on this Wednesday, midday or mid-afternoon, in the business as usual case, that peak is being reduced. In the optimized case, now it's down here. So about 10 megawatts, this is a very large site, 10 megawatts of, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, 5 megawatts of peak shavings by PV serving the load directly and also battery storage discharging to meet the load. We also see some energy arbitrage. So here, the cost of electricity in the morning is less expensive in this utility rate, is less expensive than it is in the afternoon. And so the model is identifying opportunity to store PV generation in the morning, save that in the battery, and then use it later in the afternoon when grid electricity is more expensive. Today we're going to focus on PV and battery as two of the more common DER technologies to be deployed commercially. But I did just want to kind of highlight the thermal technology modeling that we also offer in REopt. I mentioned we model combined heat and power, geothermal heat pumps. There's also absorption chillers and hot water and chilled water thermal energy storage. And so REopt can help co-optimize between heating and cooling requirements with electricity demand and how these different technologies can help reduce overall costs and overall emissions and support resilience and all that, both thermally and electrically. I also mentioned the value consideration of resilience in DER value. So we focus on resilience value of DERs in relation to how on-site technologies can help extend outage survivability of either critical loads or continuity of operations, or if there's a site that serves as a community resilience hub. There might even be an increase in load relative to baseline operations. So this is one graphic that demonstrates an example of that. In this case, there was a site that had a backup diesel generator, and with that, and some on-site fuel storage. And with that backup generator, the site was able to have about a 90% probability of surviving about 5 days of outage with their critical load. This site had a strong value of resilience. So you kind of have to think about the costs of resilience versus the values of resilience. This site had strong value of resilience. So they wanted to increase the duration of survivability. They needed to keep the overall costs the same or lower. And so we used REopt and evaluated solar and storage to support cost savings and resilience. And so this system here, with the backup generator working in conjunction with solar and storage, was able to extend the outage survivability by about 4 days without increasing overall life cycle cost of energy. So in this case, the PV and battery essentially paid for them, or the capital costs were offset by the bill savings. So no net increase in costs, but a significant increase in resilience. REopt also does detailed renewable energy and emissions accounting. So we have hourly grid emission rate data modeled in REopt. We also make some assumptions or projections about, or we use projections as assumptions about how grid emission rates may change in the future as the grid continues to become greener. And then also model fuel emissions for on-site fuel consumption, as well as renewable energy contributions. And so we're doing some renewable energy and emissions accounting in all of our REopt analyses. And then we also offer clean energy goals to the user. So there's always the accounting piece. If the site has clean energy goals related to a renewable energy target or an emissions reduction target, or would like to consider the cost of emissions, they can do so in REopt. So these are some of the clean energy goals that can be answered or optimized around in REopt. So as I mentioned, renewable energy and emissions accounting happening in every REopt analysis, but the user can use REopt to identify how to achieve some X 50%, for example, on-site renewable electricity annually at the site at least cost, how to reduce the site CO2 emissions by some percentage relative to the business as usual scenario. In that case, they can compare if there's an increase in life cycle cost of electricity in that reduced CO2 emissions scenario, you can kind of quantify the break-even dollar per ton CO2 cost of carbon dioxide emission reductions. And then we can also include climate and/or health emissions costs in the optimization, rather than just calculating the impacts after the optimization if desired. I mentioned REopt is accessible as a publicly available free web tool, and then also the underlying open source code. I will be demoing the web tool and inviting participants to follow along on your own web browser to run a few REopt analyses today. But we try to make this user-friendly. The web tool offers a bunch of customizability. Users, I think there's over 100 different inputs that can be customized, but we only require 3 or 4 inputs. So it can be simple and easy and user-friendly, or more advanced depending on how much data you have, the user's kind of level of expertise, and what phase of analysis, whether it's a high-level feasibility study or moving closer to the design phase. Some of the key outputs of the web tool include the cost optimal system sizing and net present value. So kind of mentioned those are here on the left, upper left. I mentioned the dispatch and showing how these technologies can be optimally operated to maximize their value. That's shown on the upper right here. So we have hourly dispatch data. The lower left is a snapshot of some of the climate and health emissions impacts that are quantified. There are a bunch more, but this is just a screenshot of several of the key outputs. And then we also show detailed financial outputs, comparing the business as usual case to the optimized scenario, showing the savings or increases in different aspects of energy costs and savings. And then there's also a pro forma that shows these economics year over year. That's actually currently being updated, so that's temporarily unavailable and not shown here, but I think is really useful for translating REopt outputs into RFPs and kind of planning. And we hope to get that back up in the next few weeks or months. So here are some links for accessing REopt. The REopt web tool, again, the focus of the training today, is available via web link. I also included the links for the various GitHub pages for the API, the Julia package, which is nested within the API, and then analysis scripts that allow users to use rather than just develop the API in Julia package. We also offer some web tool user guides on the REopt webpage where the tool is located. I'll point those out today during the demo. And then we also have a user forum. I think most people who use this tend to be towards the development side, but we're hoping that more web tool users also use it. So we post any questions that we receive directly to make those answers more broadly available. And then also we're trying to build some kind of community around the user base. So definitely invite you to share any questions that you might have. And our team is pretty responsive and answering those. And with that, I will transition to the web tool demo. Really invite and encourage folks to follow along if you pull up this web tool link. And I think Julia may be posting that in the chat.
Yes, and I'll also go ahead and throw up a poll while you're transitioning to the demo.
Awesome, thanks. Also, I cannot see the chat currently, and I'm happy to pause and answer any questions if there have been any questions that have popped up so far.
Questions yet, but if anybody does have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A.
And Julia, do you mind letting me know when the poll is complete?
Yeah, I think we've got a good bit of people who answered.
Awesome,
and the question was, how familiar are you with electric costs and consumption or load at buildings in your community? And I think everybody answered either I have a rough idea or I have no idea.
Great, thanks. So here is the REopt web tool landing page. There are other kind of headers up here about the projects we're supporting, publications, contact, more about us, and examples of analyses here, but we'll focus on the web tool. Up here, I'll just point out this help manual link is long but helpful, as if you know what you're looking for. There's a ton of resources in there and answers to questions. It is quite long, so it's helpful to kind of know what you're looking for rather than light reading. But here we have the link to the API and the open source code. and the user forum, which I mentioned in the slides. And I'll also point out this login and registration option. I think this is super valuable. It enables users to access past runs all in one place. And then it also allows you to upload and evaluate custom load data and custom utility rates when you're using REopt. So some additional capabilities or functionality enabled when you are logged in. I am going to log in today. The options, oh, I already signed in. The options, so it won't show, but the options are either a Google account. It doesn't need to be a Google email per se, but a Google account and Facebook account. So I think most people use the Google account, but 2 options there. And I'll kind of show these different capabilities, point these out, but this is now how I can access my saved evaluations, any custom load profiles that I've uploaded, and then any custom utility rates that I've modeled. We can talk more about that. Up here, if our team has any announcements, we'll include them up here. We recently deployed a whole bunch of updates, which we're super excited about, but are kind of working through some debugging. So in the resources that the team, Sarah and Julia and the rest of the team shared or will be sharing, we just wanted to point out that some results may have changed since that initial example run was completed. So here, step 0, login if desired, it's optional, and gathering data. We have a high-level overview of the data requirements for either financial evaluation and then also for resilience evaluations. This is a recent new capability, so you can either use REopt to evaluate just one site, or you can evaluate a screening across multiple facilities. I'll demonstrate that capability at the end if there's time, but we'll focus on a single site for the hands-on piece. This is a new capability that we just rolled out an initial version and plan to continue improving upon, and we're really excited because it helps kind of facilitate analysis across a number of buildings all at once and reduce the amount of time required for users without requiring programming skills to use the API and Julia package. Here we have choose your energy goals. So REopt, I mentioned, is always a cost savings or a cost optimization tool. So you cannot unselect cost savings, but we can choose optionally to toggle clean energy goals and or resilience goals. We're going to start with just the cost optimization, but we'll circle back and do clean energy and resilience demos as well. And for today's example, we will be focusing on PV, battery, and a grid connected case. So we can also do off-grid modeling, but I'm guessing most of the sites that you're focusing on are probably connected to a grid behind the meter. So that's what we'll focus on today. Just thinking, is there a way to just ask, does everyone have the REopt web tool pulled up? If you are desiring to follow along, I'll just pause in case there are any issues pulling that up in a web browser. I think it's helpful to, I know new tools can sometimes look intimidating, and so it's helpful to run an analysis and then realize, oh, I can fine tune this later if you want to pull it up side to side with the webinar. Okay.
Got a couple thumbs up.
Oh, great. Thank you. So first, we're going to enter a site location. I'm going to pick Denver because that's near where NREL is. If you'd like to follow along with the same example that I'm doing, feel free. If you'd like to enter your location, feel free. Next, we will select a electric utility rate. So NREL maintains a utility rate database that summarizes details about a whole bunch of utility rates available across the country. It's not 100% coverage of utilities and utility rates, and it's also not always a perfect representation of a given utility rate, but it's a really great starting place. If you are logged in, or I guess regardless of whether you're logged in, you can also do a custom utility rate. So if you know your utility and rate name, if you have a bill in front of you, you can look for the utility and the rate name. If you do not know that information, or it's not in this dropdown, you can also enter, or if it's not an accurate model or representation, you can also enter custom electricity rate. This can be either like a blended energy charge, just total costs divided by total consumption. If you know the split between energy charges and demand charges, again, demand charges are the charges that apply to the peak demand within a month, whereas energy costs are applied on the dollar, or energy charges are applied on the dollar per kilowatt hour basis. You can enter those. If these costs vary monthly, then you can enter inputs for each month, both energy charges and demand charges. And then if you're logged in to the REopt web tool, you also have this option for detailed utility rate modeling. This is definitely kind of like an expert capability, or more, I should say more advanced capability that requires pretty in-depth understanding of how utility rates work. So if you fall into that category, we do have training materials on the REopt website about how to use that capability, but we won't be going into that in depth today. But I will show, we're going to just select the first rate on the list in Denver, if you're following along with the example site. If you wanted to look at those rate details, you can, in the utility rate database, you can select rate details. And I'm having trouble in between tabs because the screen share is blocking it. Just a moment. Okay, sorry about that. So here I clicked the rate details option, and that brought up this web page. Oh, here's the user manual, by the way. From clicking there. Here's the example utility rate. We can click basic information to see the basic overview. You can see demand charges. So here we have a time of use component to the utility rate, where there's demand charges that are higher in the late afternoon when peak load is high. And then energy charges apply on a dollar per kilowatt hour basis are consistent across all hours of the year. So I think that's kind of useful information, and you can, it's also helpful for comparing and kind of validating whether the utility rate database is modeling the rate that is on your bill and kind of accurately representing those costs. There are several optional inputs. So I'm sorry, I also meant to mention the 3 or 4 inputs that are required have asterisks next to them. All of the other inputs have default values that users can choose to override if desired, but are not required. And then we also try to distinguish like more detailed inputs compared to the more essential inputs. If you do know how much land and or roof space is available, or carport space is available for PV and wind at your site, if you're evaluating wind, you can enter that information here, but by default, it's unlimited or unconstrained. If there's net metering available at your site, you can enter, and that usually varies state to state, also can vary from utility to utility. you could enter a net metering limit here, and this is the maximum system size that is allowed to take advantage of net metering. In this example, I'm not going to enter any net metering, but that is a pretty common policy that can help at least with PV economics. So that's definitely worth researching in your area. And the other inputs aren't as often touched. I will actually mention the wholesale rate. So net metering, REopt models net metering as one-to-one compensation for exports. So this assumes that you receive, let's say you pay 10 cents per kilowatt hour. It means that you receive 10 cents per kilowatt hour that you export. If that's not true, so some sites or some utilities might provide like an avoided rate charge compensation. So maybe even if you're paying, let's say 8 cents per kilowatt hour for purchased electricity, a utility may only compensate a portion of that, so 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour for exported electricity. And so if that's the case for you, you could alternatively, instead of using the net metering model, you could enter a wholesale rate here, and REopt would include that compensation. Next, we have load profiles. So I mentioned this, there are only a few required inputs. Load profile is one of them. So there are a couple different options here. We can either simulate a building using DOE commercial reference building profiles. So these are simulated representative load profiles for a number of DOE reference building or for commercial reference buildings developed by DOE, and it accounts for the climate zone of the building and the building type. It doesn't cover all building types. You can see here, I think it's around 14 or so commercial reference buildings. And then we have a few different flat load options as well. So you can choose one that best represents the usage patterns at your site. For this, we'll be selecting a medium office building. And we'll see that the annual energy consumption for that DOE commercial reference building is auto-populated here based on the building type and the climate zone. If you had annual or monthly consumption data for your site, you could alternatively enter that data based on your historical consumption, or on a monthly basis, enter your monthly builds quantity in here. And that would scale the shape of the DOE commercial reference building to the magnitude of your actual site. For this example, we'll just stick with the default annual consumption. Alternatively, if you do have interval data, so this is hourly or sub-hourly meter data for your site, or if it's a new build, if there's been any like physics-based energy modeling that has been completed to represent or estimate energy consumption on an hourly basis, you could upload that custom load profile as long as you are logged into the REopt web tool. I'll also point out this simulate campus option. If you are modeling energy consumption at a campus that has multiple buildings, or you can also use this if you have like a multi-function building type. So maybe, you know, apartment buildings upstairs or apartments upstairs and a restaurant downstairs, or a combined, I think we've used this for like fire stations, for instance. There's no commercial reference building for fire stations, but that could be represented maybe by a mix of office building or warehouse and maybe some like apartment. You can select the different types and show what percentage of the total energy consumption is kind of following patterns that would be expected from these building types. So again, we'll focus on the medium office with the default annual energy consumption, but wanted to point out the other options to fine tune that. This electric load adjustment is just if you are planning energy efficiency measures, for instance, but you don't know exactly what impact they'll have, you could scale that load profile up or down. Or alternatively, people have used this if they're doing construction, maybe building a second building that's identical to the first on a campus or near identical. You can scale that, but we'll leave that at 100%. This financial assumption section lists the analysis period. So we'll see the default value of 25 years. The host discount rates, this is the site's discount rate. The default for this comes from NREL's annual technology baseline. I do think sometimes communities might use a lower value, but it really varies. We've seen 3, 4, 5% used, but this is something you could update based on your organization. Electricity cost escalation rate. This is a projection of how much electricity costs might change year over year. This is based on the national average projections. And also mentioned, REopt has a couple different ownership model options. So really two, I guess. One is direct ownership, where the site would be purchasing the system directly. That's the default. If you were considering a third-party ownership or financing option, for instance, a PPA, you would also need to take into consideration the developer discount rate, which is this third-party owner discount rate, rather than the host, or in addition to the host, I should say, as well as the third-party owner effective tax rate. For this example, though, we will be focusing on the direct purchase option. And I'll also circle back to the ownership model options and considerations in a moment when we talk about the different technologies and incentives. So we won't touch these for this example analysis, but if you're not a tax-paying entity, you would want to zero out the tax rate. And then the O&M cost escalation rate. This is just assumed that operations and maintenance would escalate with the rate of inflation. This section includes our renewable energy and emissions accounting. I'm just going to minimize these other sections that we've already talked about. So here we have renewable energy and emissions accounting. So this accordion is included in every REopt analysis because the accounting happens in every analysis. You can also, if you toggle the clean energy goals option, then it would add another accordion here to enter clean energy goals, but we'll talk about that later. But just wanted to kind of point out that distinction. We model hourly grid emissions factors currently from the US EPA's AVERT database or data set. We're actually in the process of updating this to use NREL's Cambium emissions data and expect that to be rolled out in the coming months. Here's the assumption, the national average assumption about projected annual % decrease in grid emission factors. I'll also mention if you want to chart your load profile, I should have mentioned this here, you can see what the simulated load profile looks like and kind of see the patterns you can see each week. You can see the days increasing and then also seasonal patterns. And you can also download this information if that's helpful for you. And similarly, we can look at emissions factors. Oops. So by default, looking at the Rocky Mountain region, and we can see how the simulated grid emissions vary throughout the year and throughout the day in this region. I mentioned before, climate and health emissions costs could be included in the objective function or in the optimization. If desired, we're not going to do that because those are less typically like real costs actualized by the site. Those are more like societal costs. But you could consider those if desired. And then there's some options to fine tune different accounting methodologies about kind of what happens or how is exported clean energy that's generated on site treated. Do you want those or are they allowed to count towards your renewable energy goals or carbon offsets? And then also we have the default climate emission and health emission costs, or cost rates, I guess, down here. So this section, I typically leave all the defaults, but wanted to explain those different inputs. Next, we have our technology models. So for solar, we have the default system capital cost based on the US national average from NREL's annual technology baseline. If you have an existing PV system on site, you could enter that information here. I'm going to actually just in case. If there's a minimum or maximum PV size that you'd like the model to consider, you could enter that information. We'll leave that all as defaults. We're actually going to leave all of the technology modeling with the defaults today for the example at least, but wanted to explain these different inputs. Yeah, here we have the O&M costs, so operations and maintenance costs on an annual basis per kW of PV. Here we have different options for modeling the PV system characteristics. So which direction it's facing, we assume it's south facing, 20-degree tilt angle, but these can all be modified by the user if desired. If you, this is not as important for in the US, but if you had PV generation data, you could also upload it here instead of simulating it in REopt. But I think our model is pretty good for this. It uses the PV watts model, which is an NREL tool as well. And then we have PV incentives and tax treatment. So we have the 30% default for the ITC, the investment tax credit, which is the current ITC for many kind of baseline, I guess, as long as you meet some certain requirements of I think it's something with the workforce. I'm forgetting, but most by default would use 30%. If you're working in a disadvantaged community and there's energy justice considerations, there are EJ, energy justice adders, that might increase this percentage. So that's worth exploring your site and organization's eligibility to increase this to 40, 50, and 60%. We also, and also the Inflation Reduction Act has allowed non-taxpaying entities, not the federal sector, but state, local, and NGO, I believe. I'm not a tax expert, so this is just kind of guidance. Please do your research on what applies to you, but can benefit from the ITC even if they're non-tax-paying by direct pay option. So you could still include that in your REopt analysis. This at Makers, it's modified accelerated cost recovery system. This allows for accelerated depreciation of, or models accelerated depreciation allowed for these technologies. I don't think most community and nonprofit organizations are able to monetize this. We're going to leave it as the defaults for this example, but wanted to point out that you'd probably do no makers and go to 0% for your organizations. And finally, we have, oh, and then if there are any other incentives that your project might be eligible for through your state or utility, you could also model those in here too. Similarly, for battery, we have our capital cost assumptions. We have our performance assumptions. We have assumptions about minimum and maximum energy and power capacity. REopt optimizes both the kilowatt hour capacity as well as the power capacity of batteries, which is why there's kind of some funky splitting up of costs in the way that we structure our model. We do assume that the battery is replaced once throughout the analysis period, since batteries have a significantly shorter lifespan than PV systems. So by default, we assume that they're replaced in year 10. And then here we have the performance characteristics of the battery. By default, we model lithium ion batteries, but this could be modified if desired. And then similar to the PV model, we have the different incentives that are available, that may be available to batteries. By default, we have the 30% ITC. Again, I think most community organizations should be able to monetize this, and also may be able to increase the assumption on this one, and most likely would not be able to benefit from the maker's depreciation. But again, for this, just for the purposes of our example today, I'd like to just use the defaults for that. So that was kind of more of a demo of the tool, and I know we entered a few values, but just to refresh on, make sure we all have, anyone who's following along with the demo site, the inputs that we've modified are the site location, the electric utility rate, and the building type. So even though we just went through a lot, it's really just those 3 inputs, and we should be able to get some results. So we'll click Get Results. And it typically can take a few minutes to solve depending on the complexity of the optimization. I did run these in advance, or some examples in advance, so that we don't waste time. So while you're, maybe yours have already solved actually too, mine just did. But we can look at the types of results that REopt outputs. So here, the results for this site show that PV and battery are cost effective. Around 100 kW of PV and about 30 kW, 45 kWh of battery. Sometimes these, we see these numbers are not like round numbers. So you might not find a commercially available battery that's 29 kW and 45 kWh. So these are meant to kind of inform approximate capacities that you might be interested in their kind of general estimates of costs and savings. So this system, REopt has identified the opportunity for this system to provide $15,000 in net present value or life cycle cost savings. So this is the present value, the present value of the net savings after accounting for things like capital costs, incentives, O&M costs, and bill savings. We can look at the system performance in the example year. So here we have the dispatch. We can zoom out to see how PV and battery are supporting the load. We can zoom in as well. You can download the hourly dispatch data if desired. And then this results comparison is really, I think, a great, helpful summary of the economics and comparison. So we have the business as usual case in column 1, the financial outputs in column 2, and then the savings in column 3. And we can look and see the system sizing, how much energy the PV system is generating, the annual renewable energy percent that this PV system is contributing to the electric load, emissions impacts, how much it's reducing emissions relative to the business as usual case, health emissions impacts, so NOx, SO2, and PM2.5 emissions impacts. Here we have a breakdown of energy and demand charge savings. So here we have the year 1 costs in the business as usual case. Here we have the year 1 costs in the optimized scenario, and then here we show the savings, so negative value being savings. And similarly, the life cycle cost breakdown, so capital costs after incentives, O&M costs, total utility costs, and some summary financial metrics, including capital costs before incentives, year 1 O&M costs, total life cycle costs, net present value, simple payback period, internal rate of return, and the LCOE of PV, levelized cost of energy. You can also access your inputs here, renewable energy and emissions metrics in a little bit more detail than in the summary table. You can show the default values that were used, and some just kind of caveats and words of caution and next steps of how REopt results can be used to inform projects. I think, let's see, I might pause here for questions, and then I can go back and show the resilience and clean energy and portfolio analysis capabilities if and as time allows.
Yeah, so we've got a couple questions in the Q&A.
Awesome.
First one is, when you input a site address, does the platform have the ability to account for the orientation when roof space is selected?
Great question. We do not have geospatial data on roof angles, so that would be something that you would need to enter down below in the REopt, or in the, excuse me, the PV model. So this array azimuth input, 180 means it's south facing, 0 would be north facing, so if you're in the southern hemisphere. But if it was offset from 180, either a little bit east or a little bit west, you could enter that information. I think like Google Earth and Google Maps can be helpful for that estimation.
And another question on the load.
And oh, sorry, and also I'll mention the tilt angle here too. Not just, so this is the direction it's facing, and then the tilt angle is how much it's tilted relative to flat or direct or straight up. Sorry to cut you off there, Julia.
No worries. On the load profile section, there's limited selection of type of building. Is there a plan in the future to add more types of buildings that would match the EPA Energy Star Portfolio Manager building types?
I am going to write down the EPA Energy Star building types or building manager types.
Or portfolio manager.
Sure. That's something that our team has been looking into. Our team at NREL is not, we're not like building energy modeling experts, but there are some amazing building energy modeling experts at NREL. And so we've been working in conversations about how we can improve the offerings in our tool. There are some profiles I'll point out that are available through Comstock and ResStock. I am not an expert on these tools, but they are something that we're kind of exploring using these for end use load profiles. So I'll just point them out that they're there, and you could explore that and see if that has resources to meet your needs. Also, if there's hourly modeling information in that EPA Energy Star tool, if there's hourly profiles there, you could upload that data as a custom load profile. But by default, these are kind of currently limited to these, but definitely welcome ideas, and it's something we're kind of actively pursuing and looking into.
Awesome. And another question, for PV advanced inputs where you see gray values, are these general default values that you can keep in case you don't know the value specific to your project?
Yes. Yes, all of the inputs that don't have an asterisk have a default value that our team has researched or leveraged the research of other NREL researchers. And if you want more information about where that number comes from, these tooltips are pretty helpful. So yeah, here actually there's some kind of pointers of different inputs for azimuth, for instance, system losses, just a little more background on where these come from. And then in the help manual that I pointed out at the top here, there's actually an entire section on default value assumptions. It's towards the bottom, or towards the end, I should say. Where is it? Yeah, this section 21. And so we have a table of a bunch of different input values, the default inputs, default values, range of likely numbers. So some of these vary widely, some of them don't. and then different reference points that might be of use.
So those were all our questions for now. So I definitely encourage people to continue to put them in the Q&A, but I think we're good for you to show some of those other capabilities you were talking about.
Awesome, thanks.
Odette has her hand raised. You have a
Oh.
question, Odette?
I do. Thank you. Let me see if I can screen on. So I was hoping you could just remind some of us around when you would use REopt in your process. So it basically puts some stuff in, it spits out this much PV and this much storage is cost optimal for your site. Basically, right? So at what point do you need to know that? So if you know, and you can do it for a site or you can also do it for a campus, right? So is it like in the very beginning of when you're planning, you would say, okay, we're considering solar. We don't know if we want to do storage. We don't know which buildings to use. Let me use REopt now. Or is it, okay, we know for sure we're going to do solar and storage and we just need to know an exact number so we can know how much to buy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say both. I think understanding, like, there's a saying with modeling, like garbage in equals garbage out. That's kind of an extreme. I think the more detailed information you know about the site, the closer you're getting to that kind of ideal design, I think. We kind of consider REopt like a feasibility assessment tool. So this is not a design tool in the sense that you would want to do more due diligence, and that's all kind of described in that next step section of the results page before going to deploy a system. But some people use REopt at a very high level, and I guess maybe this could be a time to show the portfolio analysis capability. Probably get messed up if I do an exclamation point. But let's say, so one option that people use REopt for is, you know, I have 10 different sites. Which site should I prioritize for REopt analysis? And so that's one usage of REopt. That's kind of like the very early stage, like we're interested in, or excuse me, which one should I prioritize for projects? Sorry, little error. And so REopt can be used as a screening tool to identify which buildings might be most cost effective. There are other reasons to prioritize certain buildings beyond cost effectiveness. For instance, if there's Resilience Hub, like if there's a community Resilience Hub facility that's particularly critical to operating in the case of a grid outage, that could be a reason to prioritize a site. Maybe there's a large building, so it's just an opportunity for massive, like larger scale decarbonization at a single site rather than a bunch of small sites. So many different factors, but REopt could be used as a screening tool, and then, or can and is used as a screening tool, and then it's also used kind of at that high level feasibility assessment, where, you know, this last analysis example, we entered 3 inputs. So we had just location, just the utility rate, and a reference load profile. That is going to give you an output that's similarly high level. If this is the best level of detail that you're going to be able to get, then this is the best you can get, and this is, you know, you can move forward with the project. But if there's like a bigger campus, for instance, if we're looking, like larger scale systems, if there is utility rate data, or excuse me, interval data, metered interval data available, that could be like a next step after the high level screening to fine tune your assumptions. And the more detailed and accurate your assumptions are, the closer you're stepping to that more like designing phase. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. I started on the portfolio analysis capability, so I'll show that quickly. This, as I mentioned, this is actually new as of like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we're super excited about it. It's just a kind of initial capability. Right now, you'll see there's only PV and battery options. They're all grid connected. But here we could be doing REopt screening across a number of sites. I entered 10. I actually might, just for demonstration purposes. Well, first I'll show here we have 10 different sites and we can scroll across and do inputs for all 10. For demonstration purposes, I'll just do 2. So we don't have to do as many inputs. But you can enter site name, and that will update it up above. And then enter the site location. So here we have 2 different locations, 2 different sites. You'll notice in this portfolio analysis capability, some of the detailed inputs that are available in the single site analysis are no longer available in this interface because it's more of a screening tool. Here's the rate we modeled before. You'll see here, this is a different list of utility rates because it's a different location. And then those optional inputs also apply. You'll see here, some inputs can vary between the sites. Some of them are one input that if you update it here, it updates across the entire portfolio. So I'm not going to touch that one. And that one is an input that we don't typically touch much, but wanted to point that out. We'll do medium office and large office. And we'll see, actually, for example's sake, I'll do medium office in both. You can see that the annual energy consumption is different in these 2 locations because they're in different climate zones. These financial inputs for screening purposes are the update one here. It updates across all the sites, but we'll leave all the default values. Here we can see if one of the sites or multiple sites have existing PV, we can enter that information. We'll leave all the defaults. The incentives need to apply across all of the sites, so we'll leave those as defaults as well. And then we'll hit get results. And this will take a little bit longer, typically because there are multiple sites about being evaluated, but here, I guess this is a good opportunity to show the saved evaluations page. So the portfolio analysis capability is one of the capabilities only allowed if you're logged in. Additionally, saved evaluations, custom loads, and custom utility rates. So here I have my saved evaluations. For single site evaluations, like what we were looking at in the first demonstration, those are all saved here. And you can copy all the inputs over, like if I wanted to rerun this one, I could copy that and it will pull up an inputs page with all of those inputs populated with what we did. We can also view the results page, the results URL. And I should have mentioned also, like if you wanted to share results with someone, you could copy your URL and share it. There is some quirkiness going on right now with results sharing, like if one user is logged in and the other's not, or vice versa. Sometimes there's some quirks and issues that come up, so we're hoping to kind of troubleshoot that a little bit. But in general, that capability is there. There's also the ability to download a PDF of your results. And that's another way to share your results. It looks very similar to the web tool results page, but just in a PDF form. And I'll also note there's some right now. This, with the recent updates, there have been some bugs. So one of the bugs is that these are not expanded. But anyway, that's another way to share results with people. And then here, back to the portfolio analysis. Here's my portfolio, the EECBG example. I can expand that portfolio and we see the list of different evaluations. So we were in 2 different sites. They're currently still running or being evaluated. I'm gonna refresh if they may have finished. Yes, they did. So now they're both complete. We can see this, the Denver example, it's the same set of results as when we ran it on its own. And then the DC location also had a PV and battery system identified. We'll be expanding some of the capabilities. So we want to add some more upload and down, or we're hoping to, sorry, pending funding, adding some additional functionality about uploading and downloading results of within a portfolio. But yeah, I hope that capability is useful for you all. I'll also go back. So here is our single site results. I'm going to, you could also download the PDF results here or copy those inputs over, and I will demo the clean energy goals now. So when I click, if you look down at the accordions, they call these, when I select, so we'll see the renewable energy and emissions one is here. When I select clean energy, it adds this clean energy goals accordion. And there are options to either enter renewable electricity target or a climate emissions target. So we're going to do a annual renewable electricity target. We're going to set a minimum of 50%. I think the initial results, the cost optimal results yielded a 16% renewable energy contribution of the PV system. Excuse me. But we'll enter 50. You could also enter a maximum. I typically use this if I want to do like exactly. So for instance, 16% was cost effective or cost optimal. If I was, for some reason, was like, well, what would be a system that gets me 10% exactly? If I just do, or 10%, if I do minimum 10%, well, 16% is cost optimal. So that constraint or that minimum is actually not really impacting results. If I wanted to get exactly 10%, I could enter 10 for min and max, and that allows you to identify exactly 10% what's the cost optimal way to get. But anyway, we will give you 50%. We'll keep all the other inputs the same as they were for the cost optimal scenario and get results. And I think I have those results pulled up somewhere as well. Yeah, here we go. So here's the 50% results. So it's a bigger PV system. It's a bigger battery than before. And it's a negative net present value. So here we're seeing an increase in the cost of electricity to achieve that 50% target relative to business as usual. So achieving 50% with on-site PV and battery would increase the cost of electricity by $70,000 throughout the 25-year period. So that's spread across the 25 years, not each year. A useful metric, I think, is to compare this net present value to the business as usual life cycle costs, because if your site has like $1 million of electricity costs, like some of the bigger campuses, throughout a 25-year period, an increase in $70,000 is not significant. If your site is only paying $10,000 a year in electricity costs, a $70,000 increase is very significant. So that's kind of a helpful comparison point. But all the other outputs are the same types of outputs, just different numbers now with a larger system. And then finally, I will demo the resilience capabilities. So I just copied that analysis. I'm actually going to deselect the clean energy goals and instead include resilience. And so that added this resilience accordion. So there are a few inputs now that get added for evaluating resilience. So what REopt is doing for resilience is we simulate an outage or outages throughout the year. We simulate a critical load. So what portion of the typical load you want the on-site system to be able to support and when that outage would occur. And so, or how long the outage would be, excuse me. And REopt will identify a system that during normal grid connected operations is operating to maximize the value to bill savings and is able to sustain that specific outage. Once that system size has been identified, then REopt will also calculate the probability of surviving any range of outages, since these are specific simulated outages. So we'll just walk through an example of that. The critical load factor is the percentage of the typical load that would be desired to be served during the outage. By default, that's 50%. It could just be, you know, if you're just looking for like egress lighting, it could be very low, a low number. If you're looking for exact continuity of operations, you would set that to 100%. If you were going to be a resilient community resilience hub and maybe have a ton of people coming to like charge phones or cooling center or you know, even staying overnight, this might be more than 100. You could also build that or simulate it. I won't go into that just given the time, but there are different ways to try to estimate the critical load. It can be a little challenging. We'll stick with the 50% default. We're going to simulate a 24-hour outage. And by default, REopt selects 4 different outages throughout the year, so 1 in each season, based on peak consumption in each of those 4 seasons. But users can also choose to manually select those. If you click use custom outage dates, you can select different inputs. This is a very new capability as well as of 2 or 3 weeks ago. So again, really excited to share this. And then also just caveating that the team is actively working to fix some bugs. So hopefully those will be worked through in the coming weeks. So then we'll click get results. I also ran this one somewhere. Yeah, here we go. So now we're seeing another very large system. This one has a much bigger battery capacity and a much larger much larger magnitude, but still negative net present value. So this resilience, because batteries can be expensive, it's increasing the cost of energy at the site by $500,000. So a lot more than the -70 or the +15 for the other 2 scenarios that we looked at. So this could be considered a cost of resilience. And so some communities, and this isn't a REopt expertise area, but kind of in parallel with REopt analysis that can be valuable, is to try to quantify the value of resilience, or what is the cost of not having that resilience. And there are other tools available to support that. I think it's kind of a challenging area because there are obviously real incurred costs that organizations need to pay. Some, you know, lost revenue, various lost products like refrigeration. There are many different actual costs that get incurred if you don't have resilience. There's also like the human impacts that are like life impacts that are a little more challenging to quantify a dollar value to, where it feels a little challenging, or maybe even, I don't know, not unethical, but just complex to try to quantify. But you can try to make the case, okay, well, if to get this resilience costs $500,000, to not have this resilience might cost $400,000. So it's really only $100,000 extra, and we get all this extra benefit as well, like renewable energy as well. So different ways to think about that. I'll also say this example is one with a negative net present value. There are plenty of results that come through with positive net present value. It really depends on the site. I'll point out a few other minor differences with the resilience model. So here we have a resilience versus financial comparison. So before, where we had business as usual, optimized, and then difference, the resilience evaluation has business as usual, resilience, and the financial optimal. So you can compare those. Here we see the outage dispatch during the winter outage, spring outage, summer outage, and autumn outage. We also have an energy resilience performance tool, and this is also new and very exciting. So this is used to, I'm going to bump this up to 48. Here we consider the different system sizes that were optimized or identified by REopt, and then also consider technology reliability. So PV and battery, we're just looking at availability, but if we'd also included a backup generator, there are some other factors that are included in this. And then we can simulate a whole bunch of different outages and get the probability of outage survival, which I think is really valuable. So here across the x-axis, we have different outage durations. And then on the y-axis, we have the probability that this system can survive an outage of that duration. So we can go to, we're looking at 24-hour outages. There's a 93% chance, depending on the time of year, that this system could survive a 24-hour outage, which is pretty cool. And some other kind of metrics included in this as well. So with that, we have 2 more minutes left. So
oh yeah, I was about to say.
Yeah, awesome. But yeah, thank you all so much. I don't know if there's time for questions or if Julia, you had anything else that you want to close out with.
Yeah, it looks like we don't have any more questions. If somebody wants to ask anything, I mean, we still do have 2 minutes, but I'll just wrap up by saying thank you so much for joining. This has been recorded and we will share it with you within about a week or so. And I also want to encourage you to check out the link to the guide that I included in today's webinar chat that just steps through the steps that we talked about in today's webinar. And then definitely bookmark that REopt link so that you can return to it later. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you everybody for joining us today. And I hope you have a great day.